Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set? Cocked, locked. Here we go. Your dial set correctly to USA Prepares. Thank you for being in class with us today. We broadcast 2 hours from high atop the Missouri Ozark Mountains. Nathan is engineering the broadcast at GCN. If you'd like to call us, we'll pay for the call. 866-582-9933. 866-582-9933. I'm Vincent Finelli. Kyle Harris is with us in Montana. Kyle is an electrician, and today we've got I think it's a pretty cool broadcast. I really do. We're going to be talking about electricity, tips, and tricks of the trade. Things that Kyle has learned as an electrician over the decades, things that I've learned over the decades, and we're going to share them with you. It's going to be informative. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a broadcast that you can all use. Information that you may not know about. We're going to be talking about things like wire gauges, and we're going to talk about circuit breakers versus fuses. We're going to talk about the main disconnect panels, how to tell if a circuit is alive or not, how to tell if a circuit has reversed ground neutrals, reversed ground and neutral, or whether it's missing a ground. What do surge protectors do? How do they work? Do they work? Where do you put them? We're going to be talking about ceiling fans falling down. Why do they fall down? And how to make sure one doesn't fall down on you or your children or your grandchildren or people in your house. We're going to be talking about bulbs, light bulbs, why they fail early and how to prevent that. We're going to talk about outlets. Do they wear out? Do switches wear out? How do you know? What happens if you have an outlet that's warm? What does that mean? We're going to be talking about extension cords, how to know if you have the right size. So I think it's going to be a very informative 2 hours. What do you think, Kyle?
Good morning, Vince. You always start off with a full plate. I'll give you that. You know, well, I keep thinking to myself, you know, every time this is just so funny. But anyway, every time your show comes on with different things, I always think to myself, that there was a good friend of mine. I'll back up just a minute. There was a good friend of mine a long time ago that we had another mutual friend, and the older guy said one time to the younger guy, he says, "You're just a little pepper box." And I think to myself, that's about what you are. You're like a little pepper box, and you're just. I keep thinking that you need bumper music that's sort of like Scottish fighting music to start the program.
You know, my wife has a term for me, and she says I'm her radio face. So I looked it up. What is a radio face? It's somebody. It is ugly. I mean to say. So that's my wife's endearing term for me. I'm her radio guy or her radio face. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Finelli. So, Kyle, why don't we start with this? And I asked Mrs. Finelli yesterday. I said, Kyle and I are going to be on talking about electricity, and what do you think the housewife would like to know about electricity? Now, Mrs. Finelli and I know your wife come from a different perspective because your wife holds up the other end of the board, is at the garden with you, she's pulling the wire with you. Whatever you're doing, you know, around the house, she's there with you, doing, the other half. And so is Mrs. Finelli. So, but not every housewife or woman has the, luxury, if you will, of, learning these things firsthand from someone who is willing to teach them. So I asked her, what do you think that, other people who don't do the kind of things that you and Sharon do, what do you think they'd like to know? And she said, I think they'd like to know about the main breaker panel. What is it? What's it for? And what does it contain? And what do you need to know about the main circuit breaker panel in a house? And then she said, what about fuses? What's the difference? I think people would like to know, what is the difference between a fuse and a circuit breaker? And what do they look like? And are they interchangeable, or do they have different sizes? And what happens if you put in a fuse that's larger than it should be for that particular circuit? I said, that's really great. So why don't we start with that? Kyle Harris, what is the main breaker panel in a house? We know typically it's gray. It's got a door on it, and you can open the door and you look inside and you see these black-looking things with levers on them. Please tell us what the main panel is for.
Sure, that takes the main power, if you will, from the utility, and it's a place where it's the connection point where it comes from the utility, from the transformer into your house, and comes down to one very large breaker, usually, that will handle all of the amperage that your house will get. If you can have main panels that are 100 amp, 200 amp, 400 amp. I've seen them 1,000 amp, but that's depending on what size you're putting in, for your house. Most houses nowadays come with a 200 or 400 amp panel, but because of the way people have lived and houses have always been built, normally a 200 amp panel is all you will need. Okay, so that has a great big toggle switch, if you will, on it, and that toggle switch is a breaker, and it cuts or handles and can cut off all of the power to your entire house just by tripping that breaker. Or it's supposed to trip if there is a ground fault between the large breaker and the power company's transformer. If there's a large ground fault, or, where something goes to ground and it goes over 200 amps, it will trip that main, and then you won't have any power at all in your house. That almost never happens because they have so many rules and regulations now. I saying it doesn't happen because I have repaired one. In all the years I've done this, I've only had to repair one, where I went in there and worked on it, changed it out. And normally speaking, that one's fine. And then from that main, you're going to go out into a bunch of other smaller breakers or fuses or something along that line, the different amp circuits, depending upon what the circuit is for and the size of the wire. So anyway, it's a big one that goes into a bunch of smaller ones that handles the specific circuits that are designated for certain things in your house.
Okay, so class, if you have a situation where you think you need to shut off the power immediately and you don't know which circuit breaker goes to what because you didn't look at the panel previously, you haven't studied it, they're not marked properly, which is common, and you need to shut the power off to your house right now, you can go to your main circuit panel, and the largest breaker in that panel, if you have a breaker, if you switch that, it will shut the power off to your entire house, everything that's connected. if it's wired properly. And that's something that you should review with your family, your children. Everybody should know how that works, where it is, and maybe even try it, okay, to make sure that they know how to shut off the power in your house. For example, if you have a flooding situation, your basement's flooding, and you want to make sure that no one gets shocked going into the basement, and your panel is in your garage, where it's not flooded, you can just go into that panel and shut off the power and make sure no one's electrocuted from the flood that's, in your house. That's something that everybody should know. And Kyle, from my experience, I have, over the years, I've seen electrical panels, both fuse type and circuit breaker types, in different sizes, 30 amps, 60 amps, 100 amps, 125, and 200. Those are the ones that I've seen. Is there another size, or are those mainly the sizes?
That's mainly the sizes. The older style ones, they did have some regular straight 100s rather than the 125. All the newer ones now are 125s. Mm-hmm. But anyway, and I have been in one house is all I've ever ran into in my life, where the folks had a 50 amp panel in there, and that was fused.
Okay. Well, since you've mentioned fuses, let's talk about the difference between a fuse and a circuit breaker. What is? Can you describe what they look like, so that someone who really hasn't opened the door to their electrical panel, hasn't seen it, what do they look like? What do fuses look like? What do circuit breakers look like?
Well, everybody is, I would think, is fairly familiar with the circuit breaker. It looks sort of like a light switch, but it's mounted sideways. And one way is on and one way is off. And then if there is a short that happens in a circuit breaker, it'll go into trip mode, which means it's kind of about halfway between on and off. And in order to reset that, you have to take it all the way off and then return it back on. And I'll finish up with the fuses after the break. It sounds like we're coming up.
Yeah, we are. And Kyle, please let us know what causes a circuit breaker to trip as well. Kyle Harris is with us. We'll be right back. Kyle Harris is with us, and we're talking about electricity, home wiring. And this ought to be an interesting broadcast for those of you who want to know more about wiring. We're going to talk about the tips, the tricks of the trade, things that we've learned over the decades, both Kyle and I. We're going to share that with you. I don't think this gets discussed on radio. Well, I haven't heard it anywhere, so here we go. Kyle, you were talking about circuit breakers versus fuse. What's the difference? What do they look like, and so forth?
Sure. Just to recap, just for real quick, with a circuit breaker, if it's tripped, which means there was either an overcurrent. In other words, you pulled too much power through the wires, too much amperage through the wires to the particular device that you have plugged into it, that there's a system inside the breakers that is called overcurrent. Okay, that overcurrent, if you're pulling too much amperage through the wire to whatever your device you're trying to run, it will trip the breaker. That's one way it can trip. The other way it can trip is a ground fault. In other words, if say your mice have gotten into your little receptacle box and chewed off the insulation around the wires, and you have a ground wire in the receptacle box and it's touching the hot wire, that would be called a ground fault, because the ground wire in there goes back to the panel, and then it should go outside to it'll be connected metallically from your receptacle all the way to your ground rods that are outside, buried into the ground. So if the power touches, if you have a hot wire touch the neutral, which is also tied to a ground, if you have the hot wire touch either one of those, it will be a short circuit, and it will instantly trip the breaker. Or if the device that you have plugged into the receptacle develops a short inside of it, it will cause the breaker to trip. Or if someone is handling like a blow dryer or something, you see these things where people are getting electrocuted by throwing, in movies. I mean, where they throw the hair dryer in the bathtub with them and it electrocutes them. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I would say probably 99% of the time the breaker is going to instantly trip. It would be almost impossible to do that unless you had to plan in advance. But in any case, that's the three reasons that I know of that will cause the breaker to trip. Now, a fuse is a little different. If you've got a fuse panel and you open it up, you will usually, the ones that I have seen around here, which has been years and years ago, they're usually little round fuses, and they have a little window right in the middle of them. And if there is a short circuit of any of the things that I mentioned for the breaker, there's a little thin strip in the middle of that window, in the middle of the bulb, and that little thin strip is rated in specific amperages, 15, 20, 30, 40, and 50, I think, is even they can get up to. But anyway, that little tiny strip will be gone because it will just melt. It melts before there's supposedly damage to people or devices that it's feeding. Mm-hmm. So that's just a general overview of it. If you want to go somewhere else with it, let's go.
Well, okay. Well, one thing that differentiates a fuse from a circuit breaker is that a fuse will fail with too much current, and once it fails, it is not resettable.
Right.
It's a one-time use device, and it's designed to fail if too much current goes through it. So let's talk about that for a few seconds. So what is too much current? If you look at a typical receptacle in your house, it's rated at 15 amperes. 15 amperes equals 1,800 watts. How do I know that? Because if you multiply amps times volts, you'll get watts. So 15 times 120 is about 1,800. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get back. Plus, I got a call from Dr. Richard Allen Miller last night, and he said he was telling me a whole bunch of things. And he's going high speed as he normally does, and it's like, oh, by the way, I've got a convention I'm going to be at tomorrow, so I won't be with you. So I called Kyle, and Kyle's with us, and I'm delighted to be broadcasting with my dear friend Kyle. And so we're talking about electricity. So I was mentioning that an outlet, a typical receptacle that you have in your house is probably, if you were to look at the back of it, you'd probably see that it says 15A, which means 15 amperes. And if you multiply volts, typically your house circuits are 120 volts. And if you multiply 120 times that 15 amp rating, you come up with 1,800 watts. Now, you may go to your circuit panel and look at the breakers, and you'd see that they say 20 on them, or 20 amperes. And that means that that breaker will allow 20 amperes of current, or 2,400 watts. 20 amps times 120 volts is 2,400 watts. So we can talk in terms of watts because that's what you're used to, right? A 100-watt light bulb? Yeah. 100-watt light bulb, you know what that is, a 40-watt light bulb, and, you get a rough idea for how much current those two devices use. Well, here's the point. So if your receptacle on your kitchen counter is rated at 15 amps and your breaker is rated at 20 amps, it seems like there's a problem. Well, let me explain why this is okay. It's okay because there are no appliances in the United States that you could plug in to that 15 amp receptacle that is greater than 15 amps. So that receptacle can handle 15 amps or 1800 watts easily. Okay. Now, your toaster may be 1100 watts, which is less than the 1800. Now, your griddle may be 1175 watts. Now, where the problem comes in is when you start having multiple receptacles on the same circuit, and you try to have that toaster running at the same time that you have your griddle, because, well, maybe you plugged them into the same receptacle. Well, in that case, you're trying to draw too much current, and you can overheat that receptacle. Kyle, do you have any comments on that?
Nope, you're absolutely right, Vince. The other thing I was going to mention, that if you stumble into a house, or you have a house that has the old fuses, chances are 99% that you have an ungrounded circuit. Mm-hmm. In other words, it has a hot and a neutral in it, and the receptacles themselves will just have two slots. They will not have the little third hole that's down underneath the two slots on the little receptacle, and then it just has a place for two prongs to go in there. If that's the case, you have a dangerous situation, just more dangerous than normal electricity, so you need to be extra careful. I'll tell you a quick little story. My grandparents, way back, we went to visit them one time, and we were little toddlers. I mean, I was about maybe 4 or 5, and my sister was 2 or a little over, just walking. And they had a house that had what is called knob and tube wiring. And it was just basically inside the wall, you had a little insulator, and you had 2 insulators, and the wires were pulled along and tied on those little insulators, and then they would drop down to the receptacles, and they did not have any ground on them other than the neutral. Well, my sister, being a toddler, stuck a little bobby pin in that circuit, in that thing, and it just locked her up instantly. She couldn't move, she couldn't talk, she couldn't cry, she couldn't do anything. And I just happened to notice her sitting there, and I knew that she shouldn't be there, so I pushed her away, and she was fine. But just know that if you have something like that, the chances of the circuit, the fuse blowing before someone dies is a little bit on the shady side.
Yeah, my parents bought a house many decades ago. It was built in 1844, and it had in the 1840s there was no such thing as electricity, from the utility company, because there were no utility companies. But it was retrofitted to exactly what you're talking about, knob and tube wiring. So to give you a little further explanation of what that is, class, it's instead of having Romex, and that's what you're pretty much used to, it's this plastic sheathed wire with either a yellow colored jacket on the wire, or a white color, or maybe even orange or black, depending on the age of the Romex and the compliance to the color code now for the different colors of the jacket, meaning different gauges of wire inside. Well, prior to that Romex, there was BX cable, which is armored cable. It's kind of a semi-flexible metal sheathed cable, which you could bend. And then before that, it was knob and tube. And knob and tube was just simply wires that were cotton covered with tar for insulation, cotton tar insulation. And these wires were run parallel in the walls. So maybe they were separated by 8 inches or 6 inches or 4 inches, but they were run parallel. And the knobs were these insulators, these porcelain insulators, that they would be wrapped around to change directions from, going up to going over. And the tubes would be porcelain tubes that would be put in a hole drilled into a beam, for example, so you could run the wire through the beam without it causing a mild cross-connect if the beams were damp. So, but that wiring was okay in terms of it handled current really, really well, because the wires, when they got warm, the air around them would dissipate the heat, and they could handle more current. But the problem was they were ungrounded, as Kyle said. So let's take a second and talk about the receptacles. around 1960, and I don't know the exact date. It might have been 1961 or 1962. Around there, we changed from 2-prong electric receptacles to 3 prongs. Ungrounded with 2 prongs to grounded with 3 prongs. And that was a big change, and it was really important. So the reason I'm mentioning this is if you have a 2-prong receptacle and you have a computer and you want to put a surge protector on your computer to protect it, and we'll talk about what surges are in a few minutes, your surge protector will do nothing, absolutely nothing, because you don't have a ground. Kyle, would you like to address that?
No, you're absolutely correct, Vince. It's very important. You can, it takes a bit, quite a bit, actually, depending on the house, to go down and to re-pull in new circuits. I have done that for a couple of different people. Usually the cost is almost prohibitive. People don't like to put that kind of money into, if they don't do it themselves, they don't like to put that kind of money into pulling new wire through walls, because it's just quicker to, many times, just to cut the sheetrock out. Or if you can get in the basement or the crawl space to drill up, it just takes longer, but it can be done without, cutting the sheetrock. But you're correct, Vince. Your surge protectors will not work without a direct ground.
Mm-hmm. And so let's take a minute and talk about what a surge is. And the reason I'd like to mention this is you hear on TV the power will go out in a scene on television or in a movie. And one of the actors will say, "What happened?" And the other actor will say, "Well, it was a surge." Probably not. It was probably a short circuit. So a short circuit is not the same thing as a surge. Kyle, would you like to tell us the difference between an electrical short circuit and a surge?
Sure. The short circuit itself is sort of like I described before, where your hot wire touches the ground or the neutral. It will cause it shorts directly to from the power source to ground. That is called your short circuit. A power surge would be something along the lines of so let's go out here to look at your power pole. So you've got your big power pole up in the air there, and if it's normal, like residential around here, it'll have, at the very top, you'll see 3 little tiny, smaller wires. And those wires are strung, from pole to pole to pole. And it goes on back to the main, one of the substations around your town. If there is a lightning strike, for an example, on that will hit one of them wires, it will cause a huge surge in the power. It'll run down into the transformer and cause a surge in the house, and it'll blow out appliances and everything. There are fuses supposedly that are on the power poles that are supposed to stop that, and they're called gate fuses. They just snap in and snap out, and they're about 10, 11 inches long, something like that. And they come on then they swing up like they're in a gate. That's why we call them anyway, gate fuses, that are supposed to blow before it gets into the house. But if they blow, your power goes out. I mean, in the house, the result to you is the same. But I have found that seemingly most of the time they don't blow, and your device that's hooked up to it and the surge will blow. So unless you have it protected with a surge protector, in other words, it's a device that keeps all right. So if the lightning strikes the wire that's running in the overhead outside lines, and it causes a surge of voltage through the transformer, you will get a surge of voltage also through your house into your devices. And if the electronics cannot handle that surge of voltage and amperage, because remember, if you get one, you get the other, and voltage can blow because of pressure and just too much, or amperage can blow because it'll overheat and burn out. Either way, the device is fried. You know,
hold that thought. We'll be right back. Kyle Harris is with us. We're talking about electricity. And Kyle mentioned lightning strikes. If lightning strikes near the wires that come into your home, and that lightning hops on those wires, hopefully that gate fuse at the power pole will stop it. But sometimes it doesn't. And if that surge of lightning comes through the wires into your house, it can damage your equipment. And so the way to protect yourself as best as possible, if you take a direct hit by lightning, there is no protection. There is nothing that you can do that I know of. Maybe Kyle knows of something, but there's nothing that I know of that can protect you from a direct lightning strike. Of course, you want to have your house wired properly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But here's what I have done. I have a whole house surge protector. So in the main panel, I have this very large, well, let's say it's 4 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches. It's a box with 3 wires, and it connects to my to a 30 amp breaker. Actually, it's called a double pole breaker. So it protects the entire circuit breaker panel, the main panel, from surges. And then in our house, I've wired sub-panels. Now, a sub-panel is a panel that comes off the main panel. So, for example, what I've determined for economic reasons as well as reducing voltage loss across our house, I have sub-panels. And the sub-panels are connected to the main breaker panel with heavy gauge aluminum wire. It's called service entrance style cable. And so I have these sub-panels throughout the house so I don't have voltage loss. And in each one of these sub-panels, of which there are many, I have sub-panel surge protection. So I have layer number 1, which is the whole house surge protection. Then each sub-panel has another layer of surge protection for that entire sub-panel. And then I have another layer at some of the devices, which would be surge protection plugged into a receptacle. So maybe for the computers and that kind of thing, I'd have a third layer of surge protection. But none of that will work at all if you don't have a very good mechanical and electrical ground. Now, how do you find that out? Well, there's a tester. You can buy one. I'm looking at eBay. They're about $5. You can get them at Harbor Freight for about the same price. And they're 3 little neon lights. And you plug this 3-prong tester into your outlet. And it will tell you things like open ground and open neutral and open hot, hot and ground reversed, hot and neutral reversed, or whether your outlet is wired correctly. So it'll tell you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different configurations of how your outlet could be wired. 5 of them incorrectly, 1 of them correctly. And it'll tell you. Kyle, do you have any comments on that type of a device?
No, for the normal average homeowner, those are invaluable. I cannot emphasize enough. If you don't really know much about electricity and you're just starting out trying to learn, or even, I carry one in my electrical toolbox all the time. If I go into a house, it's just a quick, easy way to make sure that they'll tell you what's going on and real quick. And it's just so much nicer. Those things are just, they're worth their weight in gold as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And I have a toolkit. It's one of these fabric type toolkits. And that's my electrical or electrician's toolkit that I carry around with me, electrician's pliers. And I have one of those testers in there as well. And so let's talk about the colors of the wires. If you were to strip Romex wire or look at the wire inside that Romex or in the sheathing, you'll find a white wire, a black wire, and a copper wire. Kyle, in 30 seconds, can you tell us what the definition of each one of those colors is? White, black, and copper.
The copper's your ground, the white's your neutral, that goes to also a ground, and the black is your hot. You'll figure it.
Yeah.
You'll discuss this more. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to discuss this more because it's very important that you get these correctly. And that's where this tester comes in. It'll tell you if those wire colors are not attached to the appropriate terminals on your receptacles. And we're going to tell you about that when we come back. It's very important that you know this. And you can fix it yourself if you're careful. Everyone all set? Cocked, locked. Hour number 2 of USA Prepares. Kyle Harris is with us. He's a electrician by trade, and he's got many decades of experience that he's sharing with us today. We're talking about some do-it-yourself electricity, home ownership, how electricity works, surges, color codes of wire, we're going to talk about how to replace a receptacle. We're going to talk about how to test wiring. We're going to talk about what happens when the wiring gets hot. What does that mean? Sizes of extension cords. How do you know if you're overloading circuits? We're going to talk about those kinds of things when we come back. Oh, well, now that we are back. One of the things that I wanted to mention, Kyle, was the color codes. And you mentioned that the black wire is the hot, the white wire is the neutral, and the bare wire is the ground wire in Romex. So, class, if you were to cut an extension cord open, you would see a black wire, a white wire, and a green wire. Now, the green wire would be green for ground. And that's the color code. And if you look at a receptacle, one of those receptacles that you have all around the house, you would notice that if it has 3 holes in it, 2 slots and a round hole, the round hole is the ground. And then if you look carefully at the slots, one of them's a little bit bigger than the other. The one that is smaller, the smallest of the 2 slots, is for the hot wire. The wider, if you will, of the 2 is the neutral wire. So the white wire would go to the larger slot, and the black wire the hot, goes to the smaller slot. Now, if you have a receptacle in your hand, you would notice that the screws are different colors. There is a brass-colored screw. Sometimes it's actually made out of brass if it's an older receptacle. Sometimes it's just brass-plated or brass-colored. And the other screw is probably a silver color. Silver goes to the white, black goes to brass. And the way I remember that is black begins with B, brass begins with B, black goes to brass, and then the other wire, the ground, that's obvious because that's not on the side of the receptacle, it's at the bottom of the receptacle. So, Kyle, is there another way of remembering that, the color code?
No, you've got it. The screw down there on the bottom of the receptacle for the ground will be green. And so it corresponds to your green wire. And one of the things that I learned back when I was coming in as an apprentice, one of the first things you learned was, the ground and the neutral are called your first make and your last break. So in other words, if you're going to take a receptacle apart and it already is wired up, the first thing you take off is the hot, then the neutral, then the ground, because that's the last break. Your ground and your neutral will be the 2 last things you do. You take the hot off first. If you're putting it all back together, and you have a new receptacle you're changing out, you will hook up your ground first, then your neutral, and then your hot. So it's the first make that you go in when you're installing, and the last break, the last thing you take apart when you're changing it out. So it's just an extremely good rule of thumb. It might save you getting shocked.
Yeah, and since you've mentioned getting shocked, I bought this neat device. It was so inexpensive, I couldn't believe it. It came from China, and it's lasted several years so far. I really love it. It's about the size of a thick Sharpie, Sharpie marker. It's about that size. Mine is yellow and white. It has a little light, an LED light at the end with a little button. You push the button or the switch, and it turns on this light. But what happens is it's all plastic. There's no metal on this device. It was about $2, maybe $2.80, something like that, but less than $3 for sure. Shipped, delivered, no tax. Came from China. And I bought it on eBay, and you can too. And it's called a non-contact electrical tester. And you can put it in your shirt pocket, and it has a clip on it. And what you do is you insert this plastic tab into a receptacle, and it will go beep, 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 beep. It will beep, and it will let you know that there is electricity to that receptacle. Now, if you put this tab inside the receptacle, the small slot, that's the hot one. We talked about that. That's the black wire. It will beep and let you know that that wire is hot. If you put it in the other side of the slot, which is the white wire on the receptacle, it will not beep unless the receptacle is wired backwards. So that's another way of testing a receptacle. But the cool thing is, what I do is I will plug in that 3-light tester into a receptacle, and then I will have someone tell me when those lights go out as I shut off the breakers in the breaker panel. When those lights go out, I will know that that receptacle is not powered. That means it's safe for me to take it apart. Now, when I take it apart, I still don't touch the wires. I take that non-contact electricity tester, and I touch the plastic tab on all the wires just to make doubly sure that it's not powered. And that's just kind of a safety thing that I do. Why? Because I just don't want to get shocked again. I've been shocked enough.
Yeah, it'll wake you right up in the morning.
Yeah, and literally it could kill you. It hasn't killed me. Oh, and Kyle, when I was taught by an electrician that I happen to know, we weren't working on anything together, but he said, use just one hand. Don't use two hands, because if you're wiring and you happen to have a receptacle that you thought was not powered up, and it was powered up, and you touch, the white wire of one side of the receptacle that you've got outside the box, as you're working on it, and you touch the white wire side with one hand and the black wire with the other hand, that electricity goes from your hand through your arm into your shoulder, across your chest, right past your heart, through your heart, across the chest, to the other arm, to the other hand, to the other fingers. So he recommended, if you can, just use one hand. That way, you're not going to be shocked across your heart and have a heart attack as a result of the shock. Have you heard of that?
I have heard of that. I found it extremely difficult to try to do that for me. Because if you're trying to change out a receptacle, you have to hold on to it, So the same thing with me. When I first started out, I had an older electrician, and his terminology to me was, hold on to this thing like if you touch any of them terminals, it's going to kill you. So you hold on to it very carefully.
Right.
And it's amazing. You can find good grips on things where you're not touching wires. You've got to be extremely careful. But the biggest thing, like you said, is to find out those the problems. Use those little tiny testers, check them, and double check them, because if you rather, it's kind of like measuring wood. Measure twice and cut once. Better to measure, check, and know if it's got voltage rather than to jump into it or not. The only thing those two little devices that I have found didn't help me much with is if you had lower voltage on one particular hot leg of a circuit than was needed to power the device. I used to have one that would burn out coffee pots many years ago. In this circuit, and it was hot and it was working and it would work for a little while, and then it'd burn the coffee pot out. Well, it was like when I got a meter out, and I decided it only did it once, because I figured, well, something's wrong here. And so I started checking it with a meter, and sure enough, across those two, the hot and the neutral, I only had 90 volts or 93 volts. and it was getting lower voltage means higher amperage. And the higher amperage was burning out the coffee pot. So a meter, you can buy a cheap meter, and it usually comes with an instruction manual. I suggest you read it and make sure you understand it, or talk it over with someone that does understand it before you get going, or actually have someone do it with you. That's like you did with that other friend of yours. You actually showed him what to do and how to do it and how to think about it. Because there's a certain line of thinking that comes with exposure to this and some common sense that will take you a long ways in order to do a lot of this stuff yourself.
Yeah, and you're talking about these meters, and if you go to Harbor Freight and you sign up, when you go to the register, you give them your address and you get their flyers in the mail. We get flyers every couple of months, and I would say every other flyer you can get free things. Like you can get 4 free screwdrivers. I don't really like the handles, but the rest of the screwdrivers are okay. And I keep them in the car, and they're free. So if you buy something there, they'll give you 4 free screwdrivers. 2 Phillips, a small and a large, and a slotted, a small and a large, and I put them in the car. And they're good enough to use. They really are. They're not like the cheap Japanese junk that we saw in the 1960s. These are okay to use. They're not as good as the best screwdrivers, but they certainly work well enough to keep them around for general purpose work. And I think they're fine for most people. Additionally, they give away meters, volt-ohm meters, and they work. And so I have one of those in each car, and Harbor Freight decided that they wanted to give them to me for purchases that I bought. So we have probably 6 or 7 of them. And what I do is I collect them when I go to Harbor Freight. That's the gift that I like to get, and I give them away to other people who don't go to Harbor Freight. I tell them I was given this, so I'm giving it to you, and here's how it works. So you might want to do that, and you can check your voltage, but make sure you know what you're doing before you do it, because you can electrocute yourself. We're going to talk more about this when we come back. Class, we're very fortunate today to have Kyle Harris with us. He's an electrician. And I've never heard a broadcast in this depth on the radio talking about wiring and things that you need to know and tricks of the trade. And so I want to thank Kyle for doing this, because he's the right person for this. So Kyle, I was thinking about wiring and some of these receptacles. And there's something that I don't like that seems to be practiced. I've never done this. I have seen it done. I've taken apart receptacles that have been wired this way, but I have never done it. When I wire a receptacle, I strip back the copper wire and I bend it in the direction that I'm going to turn the screw to tighten it. And so it would be clockwise from the perspective of putting it under the screw. And I make sure that I have the maximum contact of the copper wire, the bare copper wire that I've stripped, contacting the screw, because I want a minimum of voltage loss when I'm drawing current through that receptacle. Well, receptacles for at least, I guess, a decade now have had these little holes in the back, and you can just strip the wire and push the copper wire into a spring-loaded connector. But it's not a screw. The screws are on the receptacle, and you can do that, but the receptacles will allow you to just strip the wire and stick it in this hole, and it's just a spring-loaded connection. And because it doesn't have the surface area contact amount of the under the screw type terminal, and it's not as secure nor tight of a connection, I never do that. What are your thoughts about those spring-loaded connections?
If you ever break one of them, if somebody ever does find one that's broken, and you take it apart there and kind of look at it, look at the size of that little tiny blade sticking down there, and recognize that the edge of that blade is all that is contacting the wire that you stick into that. Everybody's heard of the term planned obsolescence, so that something fails and you got to go buy a new one. Well, that's one of the reasons, in my opinion, that they did that, because eventually that little tiny connection right there is going to have enough voltage and amperage going through it that it eventually fails. And I don't like them either. I don't wire houses with them stuck in that slot. I don't like them. I hate them, actually. But, Vince, I just thought of something while we were on break there last time, and I'll run through it real quick for people. We're coming into spring here with all the wind, and we're going to get a lot of wind, and trees are going to be on power lines and different things like that. And when the power company tells you to stay away from those down power lines, they're not kidding, because they really, truly will not. I have seen many times where tree can knock it down, and it will not kill that line. It does not trip anything back there to the substation to trip anything, and that line is laying there hot on the ground. By that hot, I mean it has got voltage to it, and the average voltages that they use for residential to pump this voltage out, you see those 3 wires up on top. Well, sometimes they're 3-phase, sometimes there'll be 4 of them up there, and one of them will be a neutral and the other 2 will be hot. But the transmission voltages on those wires start around 4,160 volts. One of the most common is either 7,200 volts or 12,400 volts. So they don't have a lot of amperage, because amperage and voltage are inversely proportional, like a teeter-totter. If one goes up, the other one goes down. If the other one goes up, then the other one goes down. So you get the picture. Still, just stay away from them, because the ground around where that line is laying is extremely volatile. Just to give people an idea, I watched an owl one time that was on. It was a big old owl that was on a power pole where the cross member come across, and the owl started to take off, and its wing touched both the middle one and the left-hand side one at the same time, and he instantly just went up in a ball of flame. I mean, it's just that deadly. So, Anyway, that was a quick rabbit trail, but I just happened to think about it because we're in that time slot where, there's a lot of wind, and you're going to see, you potentially could see down power lines and things.
Hold that thought. Kyle Harris is with us, and we're talking about things that we've learned over the decades about electricity and home wiring. So here's a thought. In our kitchen, we have counter space, and what we've done is, I'm just going to give you an imaginary number. Let's say we have 4 receptacles, 4 outlets along our kitchen counter. What I did was I used 2 circuits. So we'll call them outlet number 1, 2, 3, and 4, all in a row, okay? And they're spaced 2 feet apart, which meets code, by the way. Code says, if I'm not mistaken, code says your kitchen counter, if you have a counter of 12 inches or wider, you need to have a receptacle on it, and outlets should be no farther than 2 feet apart. So we meet code in our house. And let's say we have 4 outlets along the counter space. And what I did was I took outlet number 1 and connected it to circuit number 1, circuit breaker number 1. Outlet number 2 is connected to circuit breaker number 2. Outlet number 3 is connected to circuit breaker number 1. And outlet number 4 is connected to circuit breaker number 2. Now, the reason I said that is we alternate. That way, if you have 2, let's say you have a toaster plugged in and you have an electric griddle plugged in to the next receptacle, you're not on the same circuit, so you're not overloading the circuit. So that's a tip that I figured out, and I'm sure we're not the first to do that, but you can do that too. Okay, so if you're planning to wire or rewire or update the wiring or building a new house, you might want to do that. In our kitchen, I don't remember exactly how many circuits we have, but I would say there are at least 4 circuits in the kitchen, not including a separate circuit for the refrigerator and not including another separate circuit for the freezer. when we designed our house, we decided that instead of putting the freezer in the garage, which most people do, why don't we just put it in the kitchen, right next to the refrigerator? So we have what looks like one of these Sub-Zero refrigerator systems. It's not. It's just a Frigidaire. It's an all refrigerator right next to an all refrigerator, and the doors kind of meet in the middle. So it looks like it's one piece, but it's not. It's two separate pieces, all refrigerator right next to all refrigerator. All freezer next to all refrigerator, and separate circuits for each. And then additionally, in every room in our house, we have another separate circuit for overhead lighting. So the overhead lighting in our case is not connected to any of the wall receptacles. Well, the reason was, if we ever decided to change anything, it's really easy to figure out what's what. And all the circuits are labeled in the main and sub panels. So I just wanted to share that thought. Kyle, do you have any comments on that?
Sure. Yeah, that is one way to do it, and it's a good way to do it. The only caveat I would throw in there to that is say you're dealing with, if you've got all your lighting circuits on one breaker, and you have to work on the lights, you've got to kill all the lights to work on it.
Okay, that's not what I said. What we did in our house, for example, the kitchen, all the kitchen can lights are on one circuit. Go to the dining room overhead lights are on a separate circuit. The living room overhead lights are on another circuit. The bedroom overhead lights are on another circuit. So every room has a separate overhead lighting circuit, separate from the wall. Okay, we have a large living room, and what I did was I even divided the wall outlets so that maybe just two walls are on one circuit and the other two walls are on another circuit. So we have probably way more circuits than we need, but I wanted to make sure that, at the time, wire wasn't quite as expensive as it is now, and I wanted to make sure that going forward that we did not overload any of these circuits. So we probably have, I'm guessing, probably close to 100 circuits if you look at the house. Everything, if you include all the sub-panels and you add up all the circuits, darn close to 100. Maybe it's only 80, but it's a lot.
That is a lot, yes.
And I wanted to share something else. That is kitchen receptacles. I believe they wear out. And here's what we do in our kitchen. So, for example, if we use an electric griddle, when we're done with that, it is unplugged. If we use an electric mixer, when we're done with it, it's unplugged. So our outlets remain empty unless they're being used. And we also have underneath of the items that get hot, like an electric griddle, we have a ceramic tile, 13 inches by 13 inches, the same tile that we used in our bathrooms. And I bought extras so that if any of them break in the bathrooms, we've got an exact match for it. If something were to crack one of them, if someone dropped a hammer or something on one of them, and it cracked, we could replace it with the exact same tile because it's from the same lot when we bought all the tiles. And all of our bathrooms, regardless of where they are in the house, all have the same tile. So we standardized that. But we had some left over. Actually, we have a couple cases left over. And I use them under the toaster, under the electric griddle, under the electric coffee maker. And so the idea is that it won't burn the Formica counter, because we don't have granite, we don't have, quartz, we don't have any of those expensive countertops. We just have the plain old Formica, and we like it just fine. But to protect it, we have these tiles, 13 by 13. Sometimes they're 11 by 11, sometimes they're 12 by 12. And I put rubber feet on them so they won't scratch the countertop. And we remove the plugs from the receptacles when they're not in use. Now, by doing that, we wear out the receptacles. So after 13 years, I found out that some of the receptacles don't have as good of a contact. They don't feel as snug when I push the plug into them. So I've replaced them. But I want to talk with Kyle about the different grades of receptacles. So, for example, you can get the ones that are 37 cents a piece, 10 of them in a package at Lowe's for $3.70. They're rated at 15 amps. Or you can spend a little bit more and get what's called a spec grade. I'm not sure what spec stands for. Maybe it's specification. That are 20 amperes. And they are more substantial and they'll last longer. Kyle, your thoughts on that for the kitchen?
Oh, absolutely true. Yeah, it's the way to do it is get the best you can afford. That's kind of the old rule of thumb. If you don't want to have to replace them or don't want headaches down the road, your great grandchildren will probably, if they still have your house around, it'll be just fine. You know what I mean? But using stuff like that and being aware, that's a lot of it. Even Gwyneth, I heard, talked about situational awareness. You were talking about with her and the hogs and stuff. But, the same thing is true about any part of life. Look at, when you take a receptacle out of a box, you're going to change it out or something. Look at it and think about what you're looking at. Does that ground wire look like it's going to make contact with the hot when I push this back in? Think about things like that as you look at them and move things out of the way while the circuit is dead, if you're replacing a receptacle. But if it's not making contact very well, then it's creating heat. And one of the ways that you can tell many times is you can just put your hand up there after it's plugged in, the coffee's done running, and if you put your hand on the little receptacle, the plug-in part that came from your coffee maker, say, for right now, and it's warm, then there's something creating heat there that's either not a good connection or the wire is too small or something is causing a problem there. The coffee maker is, the receptacle is getting old. So it's time to think about those things. And if it's, like you said, if you're pushing your coffee pot plug-in into a receptacle and it goes in there or wiggles around or something along those lines, then it's time to change it out because it's just common sense. Back to your wiring situation too. You do things, Vince, that are so amazing and way above code and very well thought out. It's excellent. When I was wiring houses many years ago, I got to the point where I would just wire one room per circuit. And that was overbuilt compared to code. I could have got by with less. But I took one room, like a bedroom. But if you've got can lights in your kitchen and stuff like that, and you're pulling these great big, that they're 100-watt light bulbs or whatever they are that's in there, you've got some real high watt light bulbs in it, you're going to need more than one circuit, just like you done. You overbuilt, and that's always a good idea, especially if it's new construction and you're building it yourself and you know what you're doing, or you have somebody to help you that knows what they're doing. Overbuild, you won't ever. It might cost you a little bit now, but it's kind of like that old commercial used to say, you can pay me now or pay me later, and that's kind of what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned heat, by the way, I don't think that all of this extra wiring for the entire house, I don't think it cost me more than $500 more than it would have if I went for the absolute minimum. So since you mentioned heat, there's something that I was reading about that I have grave concerns about, and it relates to heat. A lot of people have cell phones. And if you look at the cell phone chargers, these little wall warts, these little plug-in USB devices, they will say how many milliamps they are. A milliamp is 1,000th of an amp. Well, you might find that some of the chargers are 1,200 milliamps or 1.2 amps. You might find that they are 1.5 amps or 1,500 milliamps. Or you might find that they're 2.1 milliamps. I'm sorry, 2.1 amps or 2,100 milliamps. Here's the point. You can get a replacement dual-purpose receptacle that you can install in your let's say your kitchen counter, that will charge USB as well as power the standard 120 volt appliances. I have concerns about that, and I'm going to tell you what they are when we come back. Class, just a quick update. Tomorrow, Stephen Hewer is going to be with us, and George in New Hampshire is going to be with us, and George and I are going to be talking about guns. And we're going to tell you what our thoughts are on guns. So if you're interested in buying your first one, if you're interested in what our opinions are, we're going to tell you what our thoughts are tomorrow. Kyle's with us, and we're talking about electricity. And Kyle, so what I've learned is there's a device. It's a dual-purpose a receptacle, an outlet, if you will, but it also has USB charging as part of it. Now, here's my concern. When you buy a cell phone, or when you buy a tablet or an iPad or some electronic device that's charged with a charger that has a USB adapter and cable, it's rated to charge at a specific rate, voltage and current. And we've learned that, cell phones have caught fire. Well, if you overcharge, in my opinion, if you overcharge a cell phone, too much current, if you overcharge these electronic devices, the batteries can get hot, and you can have a fire as a result. That's my opinion based on my research. But if you go to the internet, you'll see posts that say, "Oh, it's nonsense, absolute nonsense." Well, I know that fires have happened, and I am concerned about them, and I do know that the devices get hot when you charge them. And so here's my thinking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the wall combination chargers and receptacles that I found that you can get for about $20 or less on the internet are rated at around 2100 milliamps, which is more than many devices can handle, which may cause them to overheat. So I'm not interested in just having a nice clean look on the kitchen counter for charging a device with the wrong charger. And what I'm saying is the right charger is the one that came from the factory with your device, whether it be a phone or an iPad or a tablet or whatever it is. The right charger is the one that you got originally. Other chargers may not have the same charging voltage nor current, and they may be wrong and cause the device to overheat, damage the device, or possibly cause a fire. Do you have any thoughts on that, Kyle?
Well, a couple. On the other side of the coin, most of the charging systems in these phones are set up, phones and different small devices that use the USB are set up for a certain rate of charge, okay, and a certain voltage and amperage, and there is sort of a large, like if something will handle 1 point, say it comes from the factory and it needs 1.5 amps to charge this phone or whatever, and you get a 2.1 amp charger. The thing that's built into the charging system is usually rated from the manufacturer at like 1.2 to 2.3, somewhere in that area. But on the other side of the coin, you're dealing in microcircuits, very tiny, small, if you will, wires. They're not really wires. They're electrical board type circuits that are very tiny. And so, even 2 amps, if there's anything that's going to malfunction, having too much of a amperage available to a small device is definitely a recipe for trouble. So your thinking is correct, It's just that these manufacturers, they'd be sued out of existence, if they didn't build in a certain level of for people that just don't have a clue, which is 99% of the populace anymore. So they have to make it idiot-proof, for lack of a better term.
What I've learned is that, if you feel your little wall transformer, sometimes they get warm, and you've got to put that heat somewhere if it's inside the receptacle box. So where does that heat go? Now, in our case, in our house, not much room for that heat to go because our house is so well insulated, and we've blown in insulation in the wall. So all around those receptacle boxes is insulation. to prevent the heat from being moved from that charger inside the receptacle box. So for us, I don't think it's a good idea. Class, I just wanted to let you know that, in my opinion, your best charger is the one that came with the phone or iPad or tablet. Kyle, thank you. Thank you so much for spending 2 hours telling us tips and tricks of the trade regarding electricity and wiring. I really, really appreciate it. And I know our audience and class does as well. Thank you again.